In the dim candlelight of a southern plantation cabin, a young man named David George whispered to his wife that freedom lay to the north. It was the 1770s, and the American colonies were on the brink of revolution. But for David, an enslaved man born in Virginia, one war didn't matter nearly as much as the quiet one he waged every day to keep his dignity, his hope, and his family alive. Then, a promise rang out like thunder. Anyone enslaved who joined the British Army would be granted freedom. That promise, made in Lord Dunmore's 1775 proclamation, changed everything. Across the American South, thousands of enslaved men, women, and children made harrowing escapes under cover of darkness. They walked through swamps, hid in wagon beds, swam across rivers, all to reach British lines, armed not with muskets, but with courage and the dream of liberation. These were the Black Loyalists, African Americans who sided with the British during the Revolutionary War, risking everything for a shot at freedom. The British welcomed them sometimes out of strategy, sometimes out of genuine belief in the abolitionist cause. They were given uniforms, shovels, sometimes rifles. They dug trenches, built forts, cooked for soldiers, and yes, some even fought. Men like Colonel Ty, a formerly enslaved man who led guerrilla raids against Patriot forces in New Jersey, striking fear into the hearts of rebel militias. But not every story ended in glory. As the war ground on, the promise of freedom began to fray. Some Loyalist officers sold runaways back into slavery. Others used them as pawns. And when the war ended in 1783, with Britain defeated, tens of thousands of Black Loyalists were left in limbo. They had no homeland, no papers, no guarantee. But Britain, to its credit, kept part of its word. Roughly 3,500 Black Loyalists men, women, and children boarded ships in New York Harbor. Their destination? Nova Scotia, in British North America. Cold, unfamiliar, and far from welcoming. But it was a new beginning, or so they thought. As the sails filled with Atlantic wind and the shoreline disappeared behind them, the Black Loyalists didn't just leave behind slavery. They carried with them skills, languages, and powerful stories. They would go on to build entire communities from the ground up. Places like Birchtown and Brindleytown. They would preach, teach, farm, and resist injustice again and again. But they didn't yet know that their promised land would test them in ways they never imagined. Because freedom, real freedom, was still a battle they hadn't won. And in the frozen hills of Nova Scotia, another struggle was about to begin. When the ships finally docked along the icy shores of Nova Scotia in 1783, the Black Loyalists disembarked with hearts full of hope and bodies worn from the long Atlantic voyage. Among them was David George and his family. The British had promised them land, tools, and freedom. But as soon as their feet touched the soil of Shelburne and the nearby settlement of Birchtown, reality began to fray the edges of that promise. Birchtown was named after General Samuel Birch, the British officer responsible for issuing freedom certificates to Black Loyalists before they left New York. The name sounded like a symbol of hope, but the town itself was anything but. Located on rocky, less fertile land far from the bustling Loyalist town of Shelburne, Birchtown quickly became a symbol of segregation, not sanctuary. While white Loyalists received prime land, generous grants, and government support, the Black settlers were given meager plots, if they received any land at all. David George, a devout Baptist preacher, worked tirelessly not only to build a home for his family, but also to build a church for his community. Services were held in homes and clearings, with songs rising into the cold air. Still, the hunger and poverty were real. Winter bit through thin clothing, work was scarce, and the racist hostility from white neighbors was constant. In Shelburne, Black Loyalists were hired for lower wages or not hired at all. White Loyalist veterans saw them as economic threats and racial inferiors. In July 1784, tensions exploded into Canada's first recorded race riot. White Loyalist mobs, angry that black laborers were undercutting their wages, stormed black homes in Shelburne. Houses were burned. Families were terrorized. Birchtown residents feared the violence would reach their doorstep. The British authorities barely intervened. Despite the discrimination, Birchtown became the largest settlement of free black people outside Africa. Families shared food, built schools, and held on to their dignity. But the land wasn't enough to sustain them, and the betrayal by the British Crown, who had painted Nova Scotia as a promised land, left deep scars. In the churches, sermons rang with anger and resolve. In homes, whispers turned to talk of leaving. David George, whose faith had carried him through slavery and war, began to speak of a new dream: Africa. As disillusionment spread like frost through Birchtown, a question began to burn in the hearts of the Black Loyalists. Was freedom in Canada just another broken promise? Or was there still a land where they could be truly free? By the late 1780s, life in Birchtown had grown unbearably bleak. The promised land had not delivered. With each bitter winter, more Black Loyalists realized that freedom in Canada came with shackles of its own: poverty, racism, and abandonment. Whispers of a new opportunity echoed through churches and gatherings, a chance to leave this cold and unforgiving soil behind and return to the ancestral homeland Africa. The offer came from an unlikely source: the Sierra Leone Company, a British philanthropic organization. Their plan was bold: create a colony in West Africa, where free black people could govern themselves and live in true liberty. To the people of Birchtown, this promise sounded familiar. Too familiar. But for many, especially the younger generation who had never known Africa but had known only hardship in Nova Scotia, it sparked hope. David George, the Baptist preacher who had shepherded his people spiritually through war and exile, became one of the strongest voices advocating for the Exodus. He believed this new opportunity could finally fulfill the freedom they had fought for. In Africa, he preached, we shall not be strangers. We shall not be foreigners. We shall be home. In 1792, after months of planning and registration, over 1,200 Black Loyalists, men, women, and children, set sail from Halifax on 15 ships. Their names were carefully recorded in ledgers: Hannah Gray, Moses Wilkinson, Violet Hill, Cato Perkins. These names would later be etched into Sierra Leone's national history. The journey was perilous. Storms rocked the ships, supplies were scarce, disease spread quickly, but hope held fast. They called themselves Nova Scotians, proud of their journey and resilient despite their suffering. They sang hymns as the winds carried them away from Canada's shores and toward a new future. When they landed in Sierra Leone, they established Freetown, one of the first settlements of formerly enslaved black people governing themselves. They brought with them their churches, their schools, and their dreams. The streets of Freetown were laid out by people who had once walked the muddy paths of Birchtown. Their struggle shaped the colony's values: freedom, justice, and faith. But this homecoming came with its own challenges. The terrain was unfamiliar. Disease, especially malaria, devastated the newcomers. Local populations were wary of the British-backed settlers. Yet, through it all, the Nova Scotians endured. David George continued to preach, baptize, and teach, and slowly a new nation began to rise. Back in Canada, Birchtown was left with fewer families, its once bustling community reduced. But the legacy of those who left burned bright across the Atlantic. Still, not everyone chose or could afford to go. What became of the Black Loyalists who stayed behind? Their story is just as crucial and just as heartbreaking. While over 1,000 Black Loyalists departed for Sierra Leone in 1792, Hundreds remained behind in Nova Scotia. Some lacked the means to leave. Others were too old, too sick, or too wary after being burned by broken promises. And a few simply believed that despite everything, they had already carved out a home in Canada, one they would not abandon. Those who stayed faced decades of continued hardship. Land grants were still denied or tangled in endless bureaucracy. Families lived in makeshift cabins built from driftwood and sod. Children grew up with empty stomachs and freezing nights. White settlers, often veterans of the Loyalist cause, routinely encroached on black settlements, denying them access to resources and legal protection. Yet through it all, the Black Loyalist community in Nova Scotia refused to disappear. In communities like Birchtown, Guysborough, and Preston, people organized themselves, forming mutual aid societies, church congregations, and informal schools. Faith played a central role. Baptist and Methodist churches became sanctuaries, places to grieve, to hope, to organize. Preachers like Richard Preston, born to Black Loyalists, emerged in the next generation as community leaders, demanding education and equality. By the early 1800s, Preston and others began advocating more forcefully for civil rights, education, and land reform. They traveled to England to petition the Crown, wrote to newspapers, and spoke publicly about the conditions of Black Canadians. Though their words rarely stirred the government to action, they documented a fight that would continue for generations. Meanwhile, racism remained embedded in everyday life. Black children were segregated in inferior schools. Employment opportunities were scarce and limited to menial labor. Interracial marriages were scorned or even prohibited. Law enforcement often turned a blind eye, or worse, toward violence against Black communities. Still, Black Loyalist descendants found ways to build lives of dignity. They became farmers, fishers, midwives, and craftsmen. They taught their children to read, even when schools refused them. They organized Emancipation Day celebrations every August 1st to remember the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1834, a holiday that survived even when many in white Canada forgot its meaning. In the late 1800s, these communities saw new waves of discrimination as Canada's immigration policies began favoring Europeans, further marginalizing Black citizens. But the descendants of the Loyalists never stopped resisting. The memory of what their ancestors had endured and survived remained a source of strength. The Black Loyalists who stayed in Nova Scotia left behind a legacy not of escape, but of endurance. They carved communities from rejection, faith from injustice, and purpose from pain. But their story didn't end in the 19th century. As the 20th century dawned, their descendants would rise again, fighting for justice, civil rights, and a rightful place in Canadian memory. Today, the story of the Black Loyalists is no longer buried beneath silence. For decades, Canada's official histories gave only passing mention to the thousands of formerly enslaved people who arrived after the American Revolution. Their stories of betrayal, survival, and community building were not included in textbooks, commemorations, or national identity. But in the 21st century, that has begun to change. In the early 2000s, descendants and historians, both Black and non-Black, started piecing together scattered records, oral histories, and archaeological evidence. What emerged was a clearer, more complete picture of who the Black Loyalists were and what they endured. The past was no longer a mystery hidden in musty archives. It became a call to remember, to honor, and to act. In 2006, a remarkable event marked this shift: the opening of the Black Loyalist Heritage Centre in Birchtown, Nova Scotia. Built on the very land where so many families once struggled to survive, the centre stands as both a museum and a memorial. Its glass walls reflect the surrounding forest, symbolizing resilience, transparency, and the need to see this history clearly. Visitors walk among names engraved in stone, real names of real people, men, women, and children who crossed oceans chasing freedom. Some succeeded, many did not, but all of them mattered. Their legacy can also be felt in Nova Scotia's living communities, places like North Preston and Cherry Brook, where descendants of Black Loyalists still live, work, and push for equity. These communities continue to face systemic racism, economic exclusion, and underfunded schools. But they also produce scholars, artists, entrepreneurs, and activists. Their voices echo the same hopes once carried on the decks of those ships to Halifax and Shelburne. Canada, too, is evolving. In schools, Black history is increasingly integrated into curriculums. Emancipation Day is officially recognized. The media, at last, is telling fuller stories. Not just of tragedy, but of triumph, too. Still, the journey is unfinished. The legacy of the Black Loyalists is more than a history lesson. It's a mirror. It forces Canada to reckon with the contradictions at its foundation. Freedom promised, freedom delayed. A country that welcomed escapees from slavery, but denied them dignity. A nation that prides itself on diversity, but struggles to address the injustices woven into its origins. And yet, there is hope. Because the Black Loyalist story is not just about pain. It is also about power. The power of people to resist erasure, to pass on knowledge, to claim space in the national memory. Their journey across oceans and generations reminds us of what it means to survive, to demand more, to remember even when others forget. And that's why their story must be told. Not just during Black History Month, not just in museums, but in every conversation about who built Canada and whose stories have yet to be fully heard. Because in remembering them, we reclaim a part of ourselves.